let's hope it doesn't happen again, folks at home. I just see my monitor. This is why I can't see nothing else work.
Good. Let's start then. Welcome everybody. This is the last day of the summer school. So far, so good. And I'm sure it's going to be just as good today. We are extremely, and I hope I meant extremely, happy to have Professor Barbara Muraca here this morning. And I will be brief, but her resume is quite impressive. So she's right now Associate Professor of Environmental Philosophy at the University of Oregon. And she also is the lead author of the assessment report of on multiple values of nature for IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And before, let's call it the American phase, she had a German phase, PhD, and a period of senior researcher at the University of Vienna. And I'm particularly happy because that gives me the possibility to rehearse my German, because she has 2 books in German. Well, I won't utter the subtitle of the first one because it's too difficult. But the main title is Denken Grenzgebiet, 2010, and then the second one, Gut Leben, eine Gesellschaft jenseits des Wachstums, 2014. Thank you.
Wow, I'm impressed. I didn't know you spoke German. Now I have to be careful.
Well, I can read 2 titles. Like, you know, I need 2 hours of rehearsal this morning.
You hope to say things he doesn't understand.
Okay. And well, jokes aside, other than the growth, she works quite a lot on the notion of relational values. She has a number of articles with this formula in the title. And just because those materials were in the reading materials for this summer school, I want to mention chapters in 2 important handbooks. And the first one is the Cambridge Handbook of Environmental Sociology 2020, and chapter is the possibilities for degrowth. And then she has, with Anna Saad, an important chapter, I would say. I really enjoyed reading that. On the Palgrave Handbook of Environmental Labor Studies, 2021. And well, I stop here. So the floor is yours, Barbara, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Lele. This is so sweet of you. Just let me say, lead author of the IPBES assessment, there are 60 lead authors, and not the lead author, one of the lead authors of the assessment, which will be hopefully ratified at the beginning of July in Bonn. And that was important because the concept of relational value has been embedded into the debate on biodiversity and ecosystem services. This is not something I'm going to talk about today, but because I know some of you are working on things that might be related to that, I'm happy to talk about that, maybe over lunch or in any other space. All right, back to one of the other things that I do, which is research on degrowth. And my talk today is close to the paper that was published in the Cambridge Handbook. So if you've read it, many of the things I'm saying here go parallel to the paper, but I will go a little deeper on some aspect, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and hearing your opinion about that. I'm not sure how much background I have to give about degrowth, but we'll see. So this is what I plan to talk about today, talking about the role of growth in modern capitalist societies, mostly, not exclusively, of the global north and its crisis. Framing neoliberalism as an answer to the crisis, including the ecological crisis, which is something that hasn't been done very much by many people. I know Lele does it, but it's not many others who consider that. And then talking a little bit about neoliberalism, focusing in particular on the shift towards understanding life and working with life instead of against life for the valorization, capitalist valorization. And then the core point is the way I consider degrowth for a series of reasons as a radical alternative specifically to the neoliberal mode of governmentality or the neoliberal mode of indirectly controlling subjects by having them controlling themselves. And then, because of what happened in those couple of years with the global pandemics, with the war in the Ukraine and a bunch of other things, I'm not sure this works anymore. Everything I'm going to talk about today. So this is the open question, just does even make sense? Are we not going to a very different direction, maybe even a new accumulation regime? I assume you are familiar with degrowth one way or the other, so I'm not going into details. The only thing I want to recapitulate for all of us here is to talk about the two big waves of critical growth. One that goes back to the 1970s, when the word declining state used by Georgescu-Roegen articulating the only possible horizon for societies was translated with his blessing into French décroissance. And Georgescu-Roegen has an interesting interpretation of the declining state, not a depressive, not a bad state, but he kind of referred to John Stuart Mill thinking of that also as a possibility for liberation. So that is one of the lineages. There are other lineages of croissance that then is translated back into English as degrowth. And then it starts becoming famous because English speakers start publishing books and everyone hears about degrowth. But that debate is way older and was mostly published in French, Spanish, and Italian, but no one considered that. So there are many lineages in the growth critique back in the 1970s. One is the ecological economic critique that goes back to the Georgescu-Roegen analysis, and the other is it's hard to frame, a kind of a social cultural critique. Joan Martinez uses the term cultural critique of growth that does not just refer to growth in economic terms, but also as a structure, or what nowadays the German sociology Harald Welzer would call a mental. But back then, the point is of this idea of acceleration and a critique of the modality of acceleration and of the pace of life, and also a critique of productivism, not just in a strict sense in the area of production, but is expanding to other areas of life. I like to call this an artistic critique, echoing the French sociologist Luc Boltanski and Yves Chapelot in The New Spirit of Capitalism, where they distinguish between two types of critique of capitalism. The artistic critique can also be framed in terms of a critique of alienation rather than a critique of exploitation. So it's a critique of the way, not of labor as exploitative in its own structure, but how it is framed. And this critique is very important because, as I will show later, neoliberalism answers and takes on the artistic critique. And there is a moment in which artistic critique is against the structure of production, which is still in Proudistic terms, the line, the dull structure of the Proudistic line, and the organization of work in a certain way. So these two traditions, wow, there was an echo. These two traditions are connected in the 1970s. What happens between the 1970s and the 1990s, where degrowth as décroissance reappears under a different fashion, is that in the meantime, the answer to the crisis takes the form of sustainable development, which is basically a neoliberal oxymoron. The idea of salvaging growth by the version of sustainable development. In the 1990s, degrowth or décroissance, which is how it comes back, degrowth as a word is very recent compared to décroissance, with a detour, because it comes with the influence of altermondialism, the no-global movement. So it comes with a critique of the model of development, and it makes sense that it comes after the whole debate on sustainable development. And it comes with an alliances with movements happening in the Global South, including, for example, indigenous movements. So it is brought back to the table with in a different modality, although it's similarly articulating this critique of growth. And the main message here is that degrowth is not recession. Your recession is not our degrowth, is the important slogan. And I think it is still so important. In the US, whenever I talk about degrowth, people don't understand what I'm talking about. Now, there is a small group working on that, but because they hear degrowth as the reversal of growth, whereas degrowth is not the reversal of growth, is an entirely different model of society. Talking about critical growth, and this would be a whole talk of its own. Just reconstructing things that you all know, I like to classify the critical growth into four types. The classic critical monetary growth, which is the critical GDP, which is just as old as GDP itself. The famous talk by Bob Kennedy, the year before he was killed, the year in which he was killed, was already a critical GDP, and it was right in the time in which GDP was established as a global measurement for the economic welfare, so to say, of a society. And that is important. It's a minor part of the critical growth. What becomes important in the degrowth critique is also the critical material growth, not just looking at the monetary growth, but also at the material, energy, and matter flows in the economy, which, as we know, are intimately linked to monetary growth. Decoupling is just not happening. There is something more to that I have already mentioned under the artistic critique, which you can term roughly the social cultural critique of growth. Growth as a mental infrastructure. And I think it is important because this is a core moment of the décroissance movement, and I will talk more about that in the following part of my lecture here. It's not just a critique of the paradigm of more, but it's also a critique of the paradigm of better. And I think this is so powerful because the critique of the paradigm of more is out there. And I keep hearing people telling me, oh no, it's not about more, it's about better. It's about, or Herman Daly himself. It's not about it's not about growth, it's about development. We no longer grow materially, we keep developing. And this is exactly the neoliberal ideology that creeps back in via the language of better. And I want to go back to it. And the final point, which is something I've worked with when I was at the University of Jena in Thuringia, looking at growth as the structural role of growth. And this is an image that whoever has heard the talk by me has seen many times. The hamster on a bicycle, to represent what it means that modern capitalistic society is structurally dependent on economic growth. And that has an essential role in what I would call the global north prosperity story. Modern capitalist society are not just societies that grow, they are growth society. They are fundamentally rooted in economic growth for their own dynamic. The idea of the bicycle with the hamster tells you that the metaphor of the bicycle is that the bicycle falls down if it does not keep moving. But this is a hamster on a bicycle because the idea of the structural stabilization, dynamic stabilization via economic growth is that this bicycle, which is the structure of societies, falls down if it does not keep accelerating. When it stops accelerating, it falls down. In fact, when you still hear, you keep hearing about crises because GDP rates don't go up or are low. GDP rate is a rate, right? It's not just a growth of one more unit. It is a kind of an exponential. Mathematician might tell me this is not exponential, but you know, whatever. Metaphorically, it is an exponential dimension. And so it is the acceleration of the bicycle. It is essential for the stability, dynamic stability of modern capitalist democracy, in particular welfare democracies. It has been essential to guarantee fiscal stability, the distribution of surplus, the social pacification. In the paper, we find a direct quote from Habermas mentioning exactly how economic growth has guaranteed the reduction of the social conflicts. Because if you don't have a growing cake, distribution means redistribution. You have to take away from someone to give it to someone else. So economic growth plays an essential role to reduce the social conflicts in societies and sustain the promise of social mobility, not for everyone, but for a relatively large number of people in countries of the global north. And it has played an essential role in the legitimation of democracy in terms of the output legitimation, not the legitimation in terms of participating in democratic decision, but the promise of well-being attached to democracy has been fundamentally linked to economic growth. The problem of this story is that it has worked because of its parasitic nature. The prosperity story of Fordism, of the welfare states after Second World War, rooted in economic growth, is fundamentally parasitic on other countries, in particular countries of the global south, but also on particular groups, social groups within countries of the global north. Which is why I terms here, in terms of the patriarchal division of labor, this is something when the unions keep going, and I am a unionist, I work for the union, so I mean, but when the unions keep going back, mourning the loss of the Fordistic structure, right? They forget that there was a breadwinner model. It was just for men, for the middle classes, and mostly for white women. It was different for the working, there is a racialized structure to that as well. But this is just to recall what we're talking about. So that prosperity story was never meant to be for all. The problem why we cannot just simply decide to move from growth to degrowth is because all the things that are listed there are essentially linked to economic growth. So just moving from keeping business as usual, moving from there to a society that no longer grows is a catastrophe that can go to a level of social conflicts that has a series of implications that we are already observing right now in terms, for example, of coming back of fascism. This model of prosperity runs into its own self-contradiction and a crisis. And there are a lot of things that can be said about the crisis. But I like to call it the crisis as end of easy growth, as the crisis of the Fordistic model. Due to internal contradictions and endogenous limits, you have the saturation of domestic markets, for example, and also the successful struggles of the working class that brings it to a certain extent to a fall. The external, I don't like to talk about limits, we can go back to that in the conversation later, but I like to talk about thresholds. I don't think there are ecological limits, I think there are ecological thresholds. But for ecological thresholds, there's also social and personal thresholds in terms of how much can you extract from people just the same. But there is also a crisis of legitimation, and I think that this is where going back to the artistic critique is important. The legitimation of that model enters into a crisis via what the artistic critique is about, in particular, for example, by the student movement in '68 here, or the civil rights movement in the United States in different places, as a critique of that model of Fordism, and a call for more creativity, more freedom, more self-determination. I think that the moment neoliberalism is a new organizing, a new way of structuring society, not entirely new, neoliberalism ideology has been around for a while, but implemented as a new political structuring of societies is the answer to these different dimensions of the crisis of Fordism. And I think that we need to keep this in mind, because I think that answer to the crisis took very seriously the articulation of the ecological crisis as it was expressed by the report to the Club of Rome, the limits to growth. It is not true that the system has continued as usual and has not listened to the critique. It has listened very much to the critique. It has listened very much to the articulation of the crisis, have responded to it. So it is important, because I think sometimes when I look at the debate in ecological economics, we're still focusing on criticizing the methods of neoclassical economics. They do not consider that that is a methodological aspect. But in the meantime, at the level of political economy, we move into neoliberalism, which has already heard all of that point, the point that ecological economics make about the importance of life. It is already in there, and it is already embedded in the very answer. So the answer to the crisis, on the one hand, takes it seriously, and on the other hand, responds positively to the artistic critique, makes it its own. And the focus of the answer is to how to guarantee further economic growth after the crisis, the multiple crises that I've been talking about, which happens via a radical restructuring of society. I use here an image which was used by, is an old image that François Schneider used actually at the first degrowth conference, right? The very first degrowth conference back in, when was it, 2006? 8, right? And I like it because he speaks about growth as expanding the capacity to exploit in different dimensions. And I think this represents exactly, now Francois doesn't frame it this way, but exactly what the neoliberal answer to the crisis is expanding the capacity to exploit in infrastructure, for example, building the highway through the Tiflis. It's not just a catastrophe because it destroys one of the largest biodiversity spots in the world, but it gives access to other resources can be extracted in the Tiflis, right? But it's not just an infrastructural point, it's also expansion, for example, at the level of money via the regulation of the financial markets, the regulation of labor markets. In terms of time, acceleration of the pace of life, the very development of emails, for example, and also in the human dimension, and I'm going to talk more about these in particular. When talking about the neoliberal restructuring of society, there are many ways of framing neoliberalism. And there are many interpretations of neoliberalism. The two most famous currents of reading neoliberalism are from David Harvey, who is a more Marxist analysis of the structure, and the other is more the Foucauldian reading of neoliberalism as a form of constructing subjects, and I will go back to that. I like to bring these together, and many authors have done that. Lele, for example. Which is true. I've learned a lot from your work. But Laval, who are two French authors who I think did that in a very interesting way. And so they consider both perspective and version in a way that I think is fruitful. Talking about neoliberalism, they refer back to Foucault and talk about a strategy without a strategist. Because it is too simple to think of neoliberalism as a reversal of the class struggle, as a kind of revenge by the upper classes to take back from the gains that the working class have achieved during Fordism. It's also part of that, but it's more complex than read in that framework. I think there is a revenge. The second important thing that I can go into is that neoliberalism, the neo is important, and many people do not understand that this is not a coming back of the laissez-faire discourse from the 19th century. The idea of leaving the market alone, the market is self-regulating, letting the state out of the market, especially in the US where I live now, people still think in that way, and that hinders them from seeing the world in which they live, because it isn't. Even the Republicans who want as little government as possible, they themselves live in a neoliberal world in which as much government as possible is needed to implement neoliberalism. And it has been implemented by explicit political intervention. This is still without a strategist. There's no that on a table. There are some people who did theoretically, but this is also a series of measures that produced a restructuring that is also different in different areas of the world. What we observe is a reframing of society to construct it as market-based and rooted in decentralized competition. As I said, sorry, I'm just trying to look at my notes here as well. It was spearheaded by state intervention. I don't know what happened with my slides. Sorry. This is something I mentioned already before, but the key point is that the lesson was learned from the Club of Rome and from ecological economics. And because the lesson was learned, two main interventions characterize the neoliberal restructuring of society. First of all, in the face of the crisis, guaranteeing and securing access to what Jason Moore called cheap nature, scarce resources and access to savings for the upper classes and for the rich, because we are going toward limits to grow. And you can see that in the modality and the neoliberalism, the modality of neoliberalism is what Naomi Klein calls the shock doctrine, as massive intervention in terms of neo-extractivism, for example. But also acknowledging life in a different way, not just the resources to extract and use for the system, but also the possibility of tapping into life's productivity itself for the capitalistic valorization. The valorization of life's creative energy in all its forms. I'm going to go a little bit into details for that, but some of the readings I have suggested can give you more of a background into that. From emotions and feelings to genetic processes. So all the creative, life as autopoietic, a self-created process becomes what you tap into to generate value and profit, basically. This is a quote. The context from Lazzarato is more complex than that, but I find this quote very good to articulate what I'm saying. I'm leaving it there for you to read at your own speed.
I'm not checking time, so I hope I'm okay. Stop me when I'm stopping to.
Well, I'll tell you when we are getting there. Together, so like this.
I like the point that it is about putting life to work according to the rules that life has in order to function and to work. And I think this is the key moment. I also want to pause for a second for those of you who are economists, I don't know, but this is important within ecological economics, because I keep hearing the critique of neoclassical economics saying that it is still stuck in the mechanistic model of physics in the 19th century. And neoclassical economics as a method is probably still there. But we're hitting the wrong enemy if we keep saying, oh, if we just move from mechanistic model to a biological model, that's the path for the solution. It is, but we need to keep in mind that that path for the solution is the path of the neoliberal restructuring of society. So we need to articulate how we understand the economy as an extension of biology, because this is exactly what happens in neoliberalism. So I think that we're still in the past if we stuck to that kind of critique. No pun intended. Thanks, for example, Clive's work. Who I mean, he's amazing, but there are a couple of things where our position diverged. This is a stark simplification of complex processes, so I apologize for simplifying that way, but I want to make a point about that. Neoliberalism is many things, and it operates differently in different places according to the different conditions, just as a strategy without strategies. When I say neoliberalism does this, does that, keep in mind that I think that a strategy without a strategist, otherwise it makes no sense. So I think it operates differently in what I would call the core and the peripheralized zones. And by that, I don't mean necessarily geographically in terms of global north versus global south or majority versus minority world. There are pockets of peripheralized zones in the global north and cores in the global south, right? So there is a way in which the operation onto the so-called peripheralized zones operates by means of making them functional to the neoliberal restructuring, and also dismantling any resistance against that. For example, where there are forms of subsistence agriculture, forms of production that are marginal and peripheral, not completely brought into the capitalistic mode of production. And that is what Naomi Klein called the shock doctrine, in terms of dismantling forms of resistance, elimination of non-capitalistic sphere, neocolonial expansion, monetary politics, military intervention. I think of Chile as the best example of that. The other, I'm not sure soft power is the right way to call it, but I like to use and connect to the discourse about soft power, is how it operates in the core, in the centers of neoliberalism, which is a soft intervention, no longer a disciplinary intervention. It's no longer about disciplining bodies, as it happened when peasants had to be made into factory workers. It's not a violent intervention, and it's also not a disciplinary intervention in the sense of the introduction of the possibility of punishment. It's another form of intervention that in a way reproduces the very idea of evolution and evolutionary theory. So if in evolutionary theory, according to certain streams of evolutionary theories, organisms adapt to the environment and the environment selects the fit organisms, then an intervention that changes the environment creates the condition for certain developments that individual organism will eventually adapt to and will be selected as unfit if they don't. So the soft intervention is an intervention on what Foucault calls the environmental situation that operates completely via self-discipline in reaction to a certain environment. This is something that is so close to my own daily life. I also live in the world capital of neoliberalism in the US. It's all about doing things because you like doing them, right? Because you identify with them, because you take the responsibility, because you have to. And so the modality of self-exploitation becomes what keeps you going, not because you fear punishment, not because there is something that comes at you. And this is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. I cannot go into all the details about that, but this is pretty much in the direction of governmentality, which is a term that Foucault has invented, in fact, and is spelled differently, sometimes with the OU, sometimes just with the O, which plays with mentality and govern as a way of governing subjects via the self-governing of subjects themselves. And I will say a little bit more about that later. But in both modality of sharp governing and soft power, the focus is still life and the valorization of life. For example, by piracy, right? I don't have time to address debt, but I think this is a core moment of this restructuring. It has been essential for the implementation of the neoliberal shock doctrine at the level of the states, public debt, that also creates a moral normativity in terms of being big states if your debt is too large or goes beyond a certain threshold. So there is a clear normativity about being virtuous in maintaining the budget in a certain way and not incurring into debt, and also paying back debts. And that's true at the level of the state, and has been worked at for the massive and violent imposition of neoliberal restructuring, which implies, for example, privatization, massive privatization and commodification. Greece is the best example at the beginning of the neoliberal resurgent society. That happens with New York State, for example, which was completely left alone in the US and not supported, because via the debt blackmailing, basically, it was forced to restructure itself in Chile is the other example, South Korea, etc. But it also operates at the level of individuals. In the paper, I make a distinction, which is a little artificial, but I hope it works in neoliberalism, between its substance and its modus operandi, the way how it operates. When I talk about substance, I focus into social ontology, how reality, social reality is understood, its goals, its contents, the contents of the norms. In short, of neoliberalism as an ideology. When I talk about the modus operandi, I talk specifically of the modality of operation, and I want to focus here in particular on governmentality, so the soft power side of it. As I say already, governmentality is a way of governing subjects. The word subjects is a wonderful word. I'm a philosopher. I could spend hours and hours talking about the word subjects, because you see how it embeds in itself the idea of being subjected. to be a subject, an agent, you in a way you're not born a subject, you're not born an agent. To be a subject, you have to subject yourself first to societal norms. And to frame it in a language that is not necessarily the language of Foucault, none of us can be without being seen, acknowledged, and recognized in society. We can become an agent only under the condition of being seen and acknowledged. So subject is a condition that is necessarily rooted in societal relations. And it's interesting how the language that Foucault uses to articulate the modality of neoliberal governmentality is subjectivation, which embed, or subjectification, depending on the translation of the French. But it includes in itself the two terms, subject as subjection and subject as activation. So being subjected also means to be made into subjects. You need to be seen and recognized by others in order to be an agent in society, but then you are an agent in society. So these two elements go together. And it's so abstract, except that if you think from a queer perspective, it's so obvious. Because you can't invent your gender just by getting up in the morning. You have somehow to be legible in society, to be intelligible in society, in order to be able even to open your mouth, to be able to be heard. You're too young for that, but queer people during the AIDS epidemics were not able to mourn in public, to grieve, because their grief was not legible. It was not something that there were no codes to read it. So I'm giving the example, say this is not abstract, it's so concrete. And indeed, in this complexity and contradiction, that you're made into a subject via norms which are oppressive, but you're made into a subject via those norms. So you can shift the norms, and Judith Butler has framed it very, very well, performatively shift into creating new possibilities. And you see already where I'm going to. I think the form of resistance of this particular modality of operation is a form of resistance that I think is embodied the best by queer forms of life, by queer resistance. And it's something that can be learned by social movements. And I think the degrowth in a way embodies a form of resistance like that. I will go back to the end, but because I don't know how long I'm talking, I want to anticipate a conclusion, so at least we're and the example of death operates the same way, right? There is a shame about death that produces expectations and brings people to enslave themselves willingly because of the normative framework, the societal normative framework about that. I mentioned this already. The modality is not to work against life, but to work with life, according to life, following life. I sometimes use the metaphor of, I come from the Alps. When you drive on snow, right? When you're driving on snow, you cannot, and you're sliding, if you turn the other way around, you're doomed. You have to follow the direction and then get in back control. And I think this is the modality of neoliberal governmentality. It has to work with life to gain control of life for the capitalistic organization. And this is all the dimensions I mentioned. The life in all its forms, so life as our intellectual creativity, emotional attachment, relations, desires, all that generates novelty in life, and aesthetic and creative action, artistic production. But also life not necessarily referring to human life or the intellectual or emotional human life, but life as self-generating, self-creative process. And the modality is to exploit living beings' own creative power. Living beings do not react mechanically to stimuli. They do, but that's not all they do. They don't react mechanically, they react to stimuli, but not mechanically. They take them on, and the reaction is embedded into a process of an internal self-creative process. So in order to work with life, you have to accept that autopoietic dimension and self-creative moment of life. And it's not just chance that the word activation is used both in genetic engineering and in sociology recently. Isn't that a core term, right? You activate a gene. Activation is not mechanical control. You have to work with the condition under which biological processes and genetic processes operate on their own. It's almost a strong proposal you give them to operate in a certain direction. And in a similar way, in the social theory, activation is used as a modality, activation by the state. The whole model, which has also been implemented partly in Italy, but I know in Germany in particular, of monitoring and controlling unemployed people via activation. Instead of sanctioning, the activation is about offering them, supporting them to support themselves. And in Germany it's wonderful because, I mean, Foucault was a genius, right? When Schroeder was chancellor, was one of the worst chancellors Germany ever had, he developed, the government developed a new model for the indirect control of unemployed people. And one of that was giving them a little bit of start capital to become literally entrepreneur of themselves. And the German word for that project was Ich AG. Ich meaning I, AG, AG is the shortcut for a shareholder company. What's the English for that? Inc, right? Something like that. Right. So it's just like, what? I don't know whether Schroeder ever read Foucault, but it's exactly what it is, right? That shift, and I don't have the time to do all of this. I'm sorry about that. I've been talking too much. So as I said, the tapping into life is tapping into desire, emotions, and relations, and intervening not directly on the individual, but on the environmental situation. I mentioned that in terms of how evolutionary theory works. So in order to structure it, the action fields of free individuals who have to remain free and feel that they are free in order to be self-creative, in order to produce and produce creatively. This is that Laval referred from Foucault. The action is brought to bear on the rules of the game rather than on the players. This is the environmental intervention. So the modality is to activate creativity and structures of desire. In order to activate structure of desire, you have to liberate desire. This is why the neoliberal response tapped into social movements that were operating to liberate desire, including also the queer movement in an interesting way. Because the liberation of desire produces the energy that can be then appropriated. And I don't need to tell you, because you know what I'm talking about, what it means, the desire related to the idea of constant acceleration, craving for innovation, self-enhancement, self-optimization, how the social media are all orchestrated around flows of desire. I need to go a little faster here. Moving to the neoliberal ideology, which this is what the modus operandi, the core of neoliberal ideology is that unleash a competition among entrepreneurial individuals is a guarantee against fascism. If you go back to the thinkers of neoliberalism, in particular von Hayek, his key assumption is that the only way to avoid falling back into fascism, he writes at the end of the 1940s, is to transform society into a market society. If each individual understands themselves as an enterprise, in competition with our enterprises, we don't have the centralization of the state control, and we will not risk to fall back into fascism. The very opposite interpretation of that in a book that came out the very same year as offered by Carpolani, but I don't have time to go into that. This reads evolutionary theory from Spencer more than from Darwin, in terms of competition for the survival of the fittest as the structure of society. The interesting part here is that Hayek is very aware that there is nothing natural to the market. The market is not a natural setting. There is nothing natural to understand yourself as an entrepreneur, to understand yourself as an enterprise. It has to be made that way, because normatively for him, this is what can save us from fascism. The market is not a natural system that regulates itself. It is a complex, chaotic system that is driven by competition, is a dynamic and spontaneous system. So the market has to be implemented by direct intervention, by the states, so that people understand themselves as enterprises, so that people operate as market actors in society. And nothing else besides the market can be tolerated. It has to become the mechanism of organization of society. So it is embedded in it a totalizing logic. There is nothing natural in competition, and it's not naturally given. So the result is the universalization of entrepreneurial logic, and that has been implemented in many ways. Debt was one of the most powerful ways of implementing it, especially in the USA. But the idea is if you understand yourself not as an entrepreneur, but as an enterprise, you, your body, your abilities, your skills, you are your own enterprise. And you manage yourself. You manage your time, you manage your life, you manage your weight. I receive constant emails from my university that they offer me for free, of course, a weight manager. Because this is the new work, right? The whole health system has moved into the new management world. If you are your own enterprise, you have your own capital, your own asset, and your own asset are your skills, your knowledge, your ability. You invest in your own education. You invest now to get something at the end, right? You invest in your social relationships. Gary Becker got a Nobel Award to analyze how families, the structure of the family and the household can be read in a neoliberal fashion. And how to have children as an investment, the logic of investment for return. And you run risks in an entrepreneurial model. You have misinterpreted the structure of society as a dynamic, spontaneous market society. Something happens to you, it's your own entrepreneurial risk. And you are responsible individually for your own risk. And this is the logic of better, which I think is fundamentally ingrained in the neoliberal logic. This is why I'm very allergic to people coming telling me that, well, no longer more, we need to go for better, because better is the implementation of the neoliberal logic. That makes them into willing slaves. I'm jumping here because I want to go to the resistance part. Just adding one point. I mentioned at the beginning how it operates differently in the core and the peripheralized areas. The intervention in the peripheralized area is any form of violent and disciplinary action against any recalcitrance to the system. And again, some of you might know this already. Usually I use this image to talk about degrowth as a radical alternative. You remember the image of the bicycle at the beginning. Degrowth is not about a fallen bicycle. It's also not about no longer moving. Degrowth is about changing this fundamental frame of society to make society no longer structurally dependent on economic growth. And this is a much bigger challenge than thinking of no longer growing period. It requires a radical transformation, at least at the three levels, basic institutions of individual and collective practices and on the social imaginary. This image also tells a lot about the degrowth movement. It is a commons-based design, so it's a new way of rethinking production. This bicycle can keep moving, can slow down, doesn't have to keep accelerating. So how would our society have to be restructured in order to do this? But it's also very white. Because degrowth is a movement fundamentally rooted in the global north and in Europe, in alliances, increasingly so, with other movements. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. I'm not going into that. There's a lot of discussion about degrowth, but I think the power of degrowth is to be indeed, as back in the 90s was said, a shell war, because it hits as a wedge the core of the neoliberal project more than any other social movement. It unveils its own contradiction and does not fall prey to the logic of better instead of the logic of more in a more radical way. And I want to say a little bit how degrowth challenges neoliberalism both in terms of substance and as modus operandi. First of all, it challenges the neoliberal ideology of growth in all its dimensions, the monetary, the material, the socio-cultural, and the structural. And as I said before, it does not just replace the narrative of more with a narrative of better, but also challenges and questions the narrative of better functionalized to the neoliberal valorization of life. So the negative term of degrowth, so many people say, it's such a negative sound. We need a positive term. No, we don't. In fact, we need degrowth as a negative term, precisely in order not to buy into the kind of enthusiastic, positive understanding of health, self-enhancement and self-optimization. It represents a radically alternative social ontology, in which the opposite from the social ontology of neoliberalism, that individuals are understood as isolated enterprises in competition, is just the opposite. People are understood as fundamentally constituted by their own relations, and the model of society is a model of conviviality coming from living together, convivere, based on solidarity and reciprocity as the fundamental roots of society and society stabilization. But they share a similar anarchic understanding of society structure. This is why I think that degrowth moves in parallel as the opposite to neoliberalism, because it shares the same kind of critique to a centralized model that was embodied, for example, by the Fordistic state. So it's a dynamic with no central organization, but it's not based on competition, but based on relation and solidarity. As I said, it shares the assumption of polycentric dynamics and of the dynamics of life. It has a kind of anarchistic understanding, which is also part of the US framing of neoliberalism, but not in the frame of Spencer understanding of evolutionary theory. And because of that, it has the power to break the neoliberal mode of subjectivation, of making subjects, and liberate desire, not for the fruition and the valorization of life under neoliberal conditions. It challenges also growth as, to use Harald Belzer, a mental infrastructure, an open alternative possibility for liberating desire in practices. This is why the multiple practice of degrowth is a mosaic of alternative. Create spaces where we can start feeling differently, because the liberation of desire is something that cannot happen in the minds. It has to be felt. It has to be felt in what I call workshops of labs of desire, where we can experience what it means to reappropriate the flow of life against the fruition and the valorization that is in place under the neoliberal governmentality model. In that little book in German, I talk of degrowth as a concrete utopia. Not an abstract utopia that presents a future possible world, but a concrete utopia that is embedded in the framework of society in which we are, which is a neoliberal society. And sizes with what Ernst Bloch called militant optimism, hidden tendencies that are already there. For example, in the narrative of desire. For example, in the focus of life is self-creating. The sizes that enters them and weaves them into new patterns that are radically alternative and different from the dominant hegemonic patterns. The powerful action that degrowth can embody against the neoliberal structure is to unveil what seems to be presented as a naturalized situation. And I'm using here the concept of the fetish, of fetishization from Marx. Hegemonic rationalities lure attention to dominant patterns and make them seem natural, which is why the market and the idea of being in competition as market actors, the idea of identifying with self-optimization, self-managing as a model of freedom feels so natural. At least it does to most of my students. So it takes a radical perspective to unveil how it is not natural. It has been made. It has been institutionalized via the repetition of patterns in that way. Not necessarily in one day, and not always, and not necessarily by it. But this is also why alternative can be framed by the repetition of alternative patterns, the shift meaning, the shift possibilities of embodiment towards new institutionalization. The power of concrete utopia is that they don't have to bring new values, they can seize existing values and turn them against themselves. And again, I'm thinking here of the modality, for example, of queer resistance, the power of the parody. I'm not saying that we need to do parodies, but I think it has a fundamental power in unveiling, unmasking the dominant structure, the hegemonic structure as a power structure, and opening up possibilities for other ways of being. I said this already at the beginning, sorry. And this is my last point. I think that there is a lot in Degrowth already going in this direction, and I think that a lot more can be done. There is a lot that we can learn from, in particular, queer practices of resistance and antagonism. I am not sure whether it is accurate to say that what Judy Butler called the heteronormative matrix can be compared to the neoliberal modus operandi, a neoliberal governmentality. It has a similar totalizing goal. I'm not sure whether it actually manages to be as totalizing as the heteronormative matrix. So this is why I'm using it without, not 100%. But there is still something to learn, because even if it's not totalizing as a heteronormative matrix, it feels like that for those who are embedded in neoliberal governmentality. It feels like there is no alternative, in the language of Margaret Thatcher. So it feels like, similarly, not being able to be acknowledged and recognized in society, not being able to be read and understood if you do not conform to expectation, for example, of self-enhancement and self-optimization. If you don't meditate, if you don't go for mindfulness, if you don't go for all the narratives about how to improve your productivity on the job via instrumentalizing, for example, Eastern meditation techniques, which is another modality that neoliberalism does very well. If you criticize the narrative, where I live in Oregon, a dominant normative narrative is what I call athletism, right? Everyone has to be athletic. If you're not, you're weird, and then it's your fault if something happens to you. So there's a lot of pressure that probably doesn't make you as unintelligible as being a queer person, but there's a way in which many possibilities of life are not open to you. You have to fight a general normative attitude in terms of better is always better. So in that sense, I compare that because it feels to the person similar as a form of resistance. So learning from queer resistance, the importance of community as spaces in which alternative possibilities of livability can be opened becomes essential. It cannot be done individually. These are the folds that can become cracks in the system. This is why one of the modalities of resistance, it's hard to have antagonistic direct resistance against soft power or models of governmentality. But this modality of resistance is a modality that shifts, that uses the folds to open up other possibilities. First of all, as labs in which people can feel alternative possibilities for recognition, that can embody different norms within that group and that community. Care becomes an essential moment of that. But it also is not just an isolation to society, it is a place of resistance because it embodies different possibilities to live in a daily life. And this is from these modalities, radical alternative can come. It's a way of reappropriating desire in what I would call protected spaces for liberation. Someone who has inspired me a lot is the Black anarcho-feminist Adrienne Marie Brown, in whom she has this wonderful book. One is Emergent Strategy and the other is Pleasure Activism. Emergent Strategy is interesting because if you read superficially, it sounds like a neoliberal narrative, because it's really talking about life and how life can create itself it's powerful, can breaks, how it is horizontal, complex, dynamic, spontaneous. She uses the metaphor of the ant or the mushrooms. So she uses the same language. She even uses biomimicry to say we need to learn from mushrooms. That's the form of resistance we need. But she turns it against the neoliberal narrative. So this is why I think this is a way of sizing that, established values and norms, turning it around, because she's creating a space for radical Black resistance. And I find this is one of the things we should try start going back to think that. And this is, I swear, my last point. Does this all make still sense? Or are we entering a new neoliberalism phase, which some authors call authoritarian neoliberalism? Are we entering a phase in which it's no longer the governmentality, this soft model of control that we are faced with, but a very different model of more violent intervention on bodies, and in particular racialized bodies? Are we entering a fallen bicycle scenario in which growth, are we already probably in a shrinking scenario in which we are in the fallen bicycle scenario? In business as usual, just without growth, which means stagnation, increasing inequalities, militaristic pacification of social conflicts, fascism, and the like. Where competition is no longer in order to win, but we're competing to survive. Where instead of activation, the word is resilience, both ecological and social. Maybe, I think that degrowth still has something to say to that. I think it is still a radical alternative in articulating that the point is not shrinking under business as usual conditions, but building a radical alternative to the capitalistic structure and organization of society. And I thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry that was a little jumping.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Yeah, Simone and Alessandro will be the discussant of this lecture right now. Then I will say a few things, but much brief. Is it okay if we use this computer? Thank you very much, Barbara. We don't have much time because then Simone has to leave to work on a different project, so it won't be as long as I was in the introduction of introducing him. But he's an associate professor of ecological economics here at the University of Pisa, and also a political activist in this city, in this region. So we are very happy to have him discussing Barbara's work.
Yep, so we're almost there.
Yeah.
So first of all, I'm sorry, I don't know, probably after my voice is a bit down today. I'm sorry for that. So I'd like to thank Luigi and Lele for the invitation, and of course it's really a pleasure to meet and discuss the Barbara's talk. For the next time, never ask an economist to discuss a philosopher, and this is a bit very difficult for me. And but of course, it's a true pleasure just because we know each other since many years, so maybe some words are in common, and I'll try to do my best. So while yeah, we fixed everything, great, thanks a lot, Barbara.
Sure.
And so one thing that is different from what I prepared, that I was thinking now after Barbara talk, since she was discussing this issue about market and diet, an economist, so I have to say something about it. Okay, the first point is this one. So of course, markets are not made by nature. But there is something really incredible about markets. That is, they are widespread everywhere. And especially from an evolutionary point of view, the thing is much more interesting. So if you go back to the letters that, I mean, like, I would say, it's called the Hernán Cortés was writing to the king of Spain, exploring South America. I was presenting Tenochtitlan, it was the capital of the Maya Empire, saying that, wow, here there is market, there are many things that change in the market. Okay, there are also class structure, there are low, and there are many things. So I mean, how is possible that two worlds that never interact each other by 10,000 years, maybe more than that, end up in institutions that were quite similar? So market were in South America, but before the capitalism, what we think about capitalism, and in a completely technology. So, but of course, why? Because as Parson was saying, they are those so-called evolutionary universal. I mean, there are some structure of the societies and institutions, say in economics, that help to adapt the needs to the environment, not that we know. So markets fit some of the needs that we have in many different situations, I think. In South America, during the Mayan Empire, whatever, and also here today, which is the problem here. So if the question is, which is the optimal size of markets? So which are the constraints of market? These are, I think, a crucial question. No? And there is something probably much more interesting about that. That is the size. So I speak about size. Think about which are the limits of market. Okay, so where we say is no, this education, okay, cannot be under markets or health or whatever. Sometimes I think there are many contradictions with respect to the movement that we have, like unions that Barbara was saying. So I mean, until this time, so until this point, really, we can say that there are a true bargaining. I was thinking, so since Stefania is here, also about feminist movement. Now maybe we can say. So look about childcare, and we will come back in a second about this. So if really you think that the emancipation of women is also involvement in working hours and so on, so maybe you are thinking to substitute childcare. I don't think that is, again, don't be, my position is different, but so you mean you are producing a market for childcare just because, of course, we want the emancipation of women can go to work and maybe get happy in the life. So I mean, I don't want to simplify too much. Of course, I'm an economist, so I have to. But I mean, there are some contradictions when we think about the limitation of market that is to take into account. Remember that the market is something that helps a lot our society and find so many solutions to the needs that we have. Okay. So then I stop because I finish my time, but then I still have. Okay, great. No, just so there is something that I start speaking about this issue to the students in class. So when Lincoln made the blockage of ports for the export of cotton in UK, what happens? It happens something incredible because producers in India stop producing their own crops and start producing cotton. Okay, there was no, an authority going to India and says to the farmer in India, please start and go to produce cotton. It's the price mechanism, no? That made it possible that people that do not interact never, they start producing cotton because at that point it was more convenient for them. So maybe we don't like, I don't know, but it works. It works, I don't know, with thousands of kilometers of distance. Okay, and since the cotton was different in India from the US one, so the textile industry in UK has to make some innovation in order to use that new cotton, no? Quality. So I mean, markets have coordination in a way that is incredibly strong. Okay, I don't want to be so, I don't like those markets, but just to recognize that there are some, it's an institution that help in coordination that is really difficult to think to other systems can do it. Okay, so this example of cotton I think is nice. So since Barbara was discussing about this rate of growth issue, so one thing that I think is important, so why economists, but not only economists now, unfortunately, also, I think it's good, it doesn't matter for me, doesn't matter. So why we believe that the rate of growth is so important? Okay, Barbara made a very useful statement. Of course, it's a stabilizer, the mouse on the bike. Exactly. That, of course, if you stop, you fell down. This is really clear. But there is something important to think about material well-being. And why is a rate of growth that is so important? So think about 3 economies that grow at different rates. So imagine that the first is China, let's say, is growing per year at 6% per year. Okay, And there is Italy, something like that, that grows to 1% per year. If I ask you, how long does it take these three economies to double the income, what do you say? So why? So maybe you forget about this. No, okay, of course we know that
Income and not output.
income and in production, let's say
Okay.
GDP. Okay, let's say GDP. What do you think is the answer? So okay, it's not difficult, but forget about math. Okay, so the point is this one: that this economy is almost 12 years to double the GDP. This economy is 70 years. Okay, to double the income. So if today the two economies are equal, the ones that is living here, after 12 years, the GDP is double, while this one in one generation probably didn't get double the income, while this one in one generation you have a double the income maybe 8 times. Why is it important? There are very bad things about growth. There is something really useful. You can do many things. Barbara can come from Oregon here. I mean, that is important for me also. Of course, you can organize school, you can organize taxation, you can do many services. So I mean, consider that the strength of the rate of growth is something important. Okay, and I think that this one is the main issue why most of the people are still interested in the rate of growth. Okay, so but of course. There is something wrong. Okay, there are many slides in this presentation to show the why this made wrong. So, but I was okay. This was a difference between Philippines and South Korea. Only one case in which the two economies diverge a lot. Forget about this. So there was something really interesting in the Barbara talk. One issue was about the capacity of exploit. It is quite similar to what I was saying. So, which have the limitation of what we consider some market economy or pure economic relationship. And I was really surprised to see that also relational goods are becoming something that can be marketized. I don't know how you say in English exactly, but I think the words or consumed. This is a nice picture, and you cannot see anything probably. But it's about balls.
It's nice.
So, I mean, so imagine to stay in a little village, okay? This little village for generations, kids were playing in the street, okay? And then at a certain point, nobody who knows why exactly, but nobody is in the street. But when they start to recover, so the roof of the church, they found tons of balls for the kids. But now there is no kids playing around, okay? So after 20 years, okay, they go to the roof and they find tons of balls. Nobody now is playing in this village because, of course, childcare is something that is organized in a different way. They are not playing in it. So this is a sort of how market can maybe change also the social life in a very small city. But of course, the future is still more difficult to think. So I mean, we just recruited a new colleague in our department, and yesterday told me, okay, yeah, 2 days ago I was playing in metaverse ping pong with my father. I said, well, what are you saying? So I mean, his father is in Spain, he's just recruited here. So I say, we want to continue to play ping pong because it's something that we like. So just do it in metaverse and do it. Okay? And so I mean, this is a desire that we never thought about, but it's becoming possible. And of course, it's something where people take a lot of profit in this stuff. I don't know how much does this cost to have the only one stuff for playing ping pong. I never tried. Now I want to, of course. But it seems to work really well. It's not another exercising because, of course, I'm not. So this again is how much you can think that this procedure can go on, even if you can start playing playing ping pong in 2 different countries. Someone can exploit some advantage from making your relational good between you and your parents. Okay, so it's quite shocking, I think, and just to say that we don't have limitation about it. So if we are not finding some institution or some alternatives, the last 3 minutes probably. I think that this issue is quite.
We have 5, so don't run.
No.
5 full minutes.
There is still one issue that in our literature take the name of defensive growth. That I think is much in line with most of the things that Barbara was saying. and I try really help. So if you can make a comment on it. This idea of defensive consumption is really simple. I mean, you have an increase in environmental degradation, you have a power, so a declining power in relation of goods in many ways, so there are a lot of marginalization. What happens? It happens that in order to feel better, you need money. Because thanks to money, you can try to block the negative effect of environmental degradation to you, and also the effect of being, marginalized. But if you need money, you need to work hard, maybe harder than before. And you start to compete with other colleagues, friends, whatever, in order to... So social comparison became really more important in this life. And what happens? That of course the GDP is increasing a lot. But of course we know the GDP tend to increase environmental degradation and also, the problems that we try to solve. So this is a vicious cycle that I think is really explaining most of the issue about the relationship between also the happiness, nature, or well-being, social also well-being, and what our critique about the growth. And I think it's something strictly connected to what Barbara is trying to say, of course, even in different words, different images. And so, how we can go out from this vicious cycle? Okay. One bracket. The point that Barbara was making about modus operandi and soft power, I think is great. Okay. And also this relationship between what this modus operandi is different in the center and the periphery, of the world, let's say. So of course, don't forget that things are not going so well also in our, and this is a very nice survey made by Walls that is going to the opening tomorrow, and with where they try to account how much of the workforce is for supervision, okay? And they found some numbers that are really incredible. I mean, in the US, 50% of the working force is only for monitoring activity of the other. Okay, of course, there are also prisons, so there are also other forces, military forces, and so on. And if you see these numbers, it's quite high. But of course, there are many differences between institutions. Okay, so why is this important? Because of course, this is not a productive work. They're not making anything for the society. It's just a problem of checking that the other are doing well. So it's really, something that we are. So it's something that we really don't need it because we need trust in the society. Probably this work is really important. Okay, and of course, I think in other countries, in the periphery, probably is much worse than that. So, out of the brackets, and the last point. So this is a bit how we think about the interaction. Well, how most of us are some sort of degrowth proponents. So we know that there is a sort of vicious cycle here. There is the one that I was discussing before. And the problem is that what happens to life satisfaction in general. Why? Because of course we think that the organization of society should work in order to make some goals for the people. The people feel better, can reach and satisfy their needs. So what happens? There is something that probably, this is what we were discussing before. So if my participation, my relational goods, my commons, my social capital decline, then of course I need to work a bit more. So if this is go down, this is go up, and so I need more income and this more consumption, so this negative effect on. Okay, so this idea of defensive consumption that I was trying to explain before. So something different would be which kind of transformations, okay, or social policies that the sociological literature is doing can create a break in this vicious cycle. So it's possible that an increase in relational goods through some kind of policies can generate an increase in life satisfaction that mediates the relationship between consumption, income, and well-being. Okay, so if we are able to create the right relational goods, I say here, but consider social capital commons as probably much more close to the rich or some other way, institution that can reduce the strength at which income is important for life satisfaction. Because if you're able to do it, then probably another virtuous cycle will come out. Because of course, if I'm okay, why I have to starve to work in order to get some money. We don't know why exactly we work so hard. This is another issue. I mean, but if I can satisfy my needs and to have a good quality of life with low money, so probably my competition, remember the two guys that are running or the bike and so on, are less important. So people can maybe reduce working hours, that we know is important, as also environmental policies, and so we can try to do less. So of course I think that this idea is a kind of a mediation between, so like how relational goods, commons and others can reduce the strength of the relationship between income and well-being or life satisfaction in general, is something that really I would like to ask Barbara what do you think about. And so thank you very much for inviting me. And
Great. So we are perfectly on time, I would say.
Let's go to drink coffee and food. We come back here to discuss collectively all this wonderful stuff. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Right. Can I respond to the respondent later?
That he won't be here, but we will record and.
No, it's okay.
faremo accento, ci va scusa.
Ma infatti facciamo così, ti lascio rispondere se si vede bene. No, si le mie questioni sono